got to town and we started doing St. Patrick's Days, and that's how I met most of these guys.
Have at it.
Okay, so I got to San Diego in 1971. Whoops, start. I got to San Diego in 1975, came out of Stanford Law School, came to work downtown at a firm called Gray Carey, and one of the fellows who was also a young lawyer at that time, a few years ahead of me, was a guy named Danny Broderick. And so Danny and I became friends quickly, and I started asking about where everyone celebrated on St. Patrick's Day, and the answer was there wasn't an organized a celebration, and that led to a bet that I made with another guy that Danny introduced me to named Vince Bartolotta. And I bet Vince a bottle of Bushmills that I could put more people in a place called Quinn's Pub on St. Patrick's Day 1976 than he could. And Harry Quinn had a pub about 6 blocks from the place where I was renting at the time, and I'd gotten to know him, and I went and cut a deal with Harry that he would have live music from noon until closing time, and he would set up kegs in 3 of the corners of the bar at Turquoise and La Jolla Boulevard, and that I'd fill the place. And so come St. Patrick's Day, a number of the people at my firm, which was the largest law firm in town, so I had some bodies, including some paralegals, which made a big difference in attracting some of the boys, all rolled out to Quinn's Pub, and Vince showed up, and he'd been in town for a lot longer, and he had a lot of other buddies, and so pretty soon we had a full place. Now Harry lived up to his deal, other than the live music from noon to 4 was a black fellow playing the blues, which wasn't exactly what we were looking for. So when he took a break, I got 4 of the paralegals up on the stage with me just to sing When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. And the next thing we knew, a guy came up out of the crowd who I'd never seen before and started playing the piano right along with us and never missed a beat. His name was Michael Joseph Reedy. And before too long, another fellow popped up out of the crowd, and he told a couple of poems, and his name was Robert McNamara. So it was the beginning, as they say in Casablanca, of a beautiful friendship. And a lot of those boys became presidents of the Friendly Sons along the way, along with, of course, Mike Neal, who was there as well, and Leo Sullivan, who will argue with you about what year it was, but it was 1976 for the record. Before too long, I joined the Friendly Sons in 1979. The president then was a guy named Don McGrath, and he was a lawyer, and I had met him through some buddies of his who were in my law firm, and we spent a lot of time together over the early years, including one St. Patrick's Day where he suggested I go along with him in a limo that he had booked. And Donnie was a guy who had a tendency to irritate people, particularly after he was a bit the worse for drink taken. And so he had learned the hard way that he needed to help manage his behavior on St. Patrick's Day. So he took along a guy named Bob Babbage, who was the starting middle linebacker for the San Diego Chargers, and he accompanied us for the first few hours of St. Patrick's Day to try and keep Donnie alive and be able to get him out of the pubs that we went into. After I watched that for a couple of hours, I decided to take a pass on the rest of it and joined the fellows for music down where Mike Reedy and his buddies were then the In-Case Trio, and they were playing down, I think, at McDinney's, if I recall correctly, and the local TV station would come down and film 30 or 45 seconds of the In-Case Trio playing on St. Patrick's Day for their 6 o'clock news every night, which got some guys in trouble when their wives watched the TV and saw what was going on. But that's a side note. Um, so fast forward a few years, and a fellow named Mike McCarthy was the president of the Friendly Sons, one of the finest gentlemen and nicest guys you could ever want to meet, and he leaned on me to agree to join the board of directors of the club, and that was the start of a 6 or 7 year process that ended up with me becoming the president in 2002, and so that was the evolution of that whole story and how I ended up as one of the presidents of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. What should we talk about now?
The board meetings at that time were generally held when, from your time with the club?
Well, they were
When and where?
5 o'clock meetings over at Mike Neal's law office, which was a short walk from my office, and so very convenient. Mike had grown up in a firm called, at one point in time, Holt Rhodes in Hollywood, and I want to say one of those fellows had a car that was in the parade for a number of years, but I forget which one. Michael could tell you that one. And there was always cold beer ready for us, and so we would have let Mike host those meetings for life had his partners been prepared to put up with us once a month every, I think we did them on Wednesday nights, if I recall correctly, but I got to apprentice under some good presidents there, but in addition to Mike McCarthy, Bobby McNamara was the next fellow, and then Bobby Sexton. I had met Bobby's dad, who was also a past president, when I first came to a town, and he was quite the man about town. Also a pretty good singer, I might add, a fair bit better than his son, truth be told. Sexy has other redeeming features, many of them, but the singing isn't actually one of them. He didn't get that gene from his father. And then, of course, Jim Burke, who put a little backbone in the organization from time to time, and was a wonderful friend and guy to follow up. And then Dave Harrison, and then I became the chair. Shortly before I became the president, we had to get a new recording secretary for the club, and one of the other members of the board volunteered his wife, Toby Giesting, who for many years was our recording secretary and did a fabulous job, and we eventually snarfed her and got her involved in the American Ireland Fund as well, and she did a great job there for years as well, but I digress, which happens these days. And Tommy Henderson was on the board with me in those days, and he's a very funny guy. You have to pay attention because he's a subtle fellow. Unlike clearly the funniest son ever to come along the path, and I think he would win by acclaim, Bob Mulrooney. And for many years, and sometimes still do, have Bob get up and do his routines, although there's a limited number of them, so if you've seen them a few times, you can do them, but you can't do them as well as Mulrooney can do them, and that's the important lesson to be taken away from.
Henderson was pretty funny when I interviewed him. Who's the funniest son? And he goes,
excluding myself.
He said, it's me.
Yeah, right. Well, Tom has a dry wit and a marvelous sense of humor, and is just a wonderful, wonderful guy. So let's see, special events at the Sons dinner. So in the old days, we had the Friendly Sons black tie dinner on the holy day itself. And that created a complex set of issues for people to deal with. One was that from about 1978 or so onward, the In-Case Trios would start playing usually about noon, worst case 1 o'clock, and so the drinking would commence then. And so by the time you got to 6 o'clock, everybody had a snootful, and then it was time at 5:30 to rush home or to your hotel room and get a tuxedo on, and then make your way to wherever the black tie dinner was. And so for many years it was over at the U.S. Grant, and we would take over their lobby, which was a beautiful lobby, is a beautiful lobby, for that purpose. And so the dinners involved a much higher level of blood alcohol at the beginning than was probably smart, and that had consequences in terms of the behavior, in terms of people going face down in their mashed potatoes, a whole series of issues. It also involved a complex set of negotiations with spouses, many of whom had accompanied the frivolity during the afternoon, listening to the In-Case Trio, and then were told politely, or maybe not so politely, at 5:30 to get lost because we were all going over to have fun without them at the black tie dinner. The highlight of that whole scenario was probably the puppet show that somebody decided to put on as the entertainment one year at the black tie dinner, and they had some cat come in with a whole big setup to put on a puppet show that for some reason somebody thought was going to be terribly entertaining. It was found wanting in the eyes of the majority of those in attendance, which resulted then in a barrage of dinner rolls going up on the stage, aimed initially at the puppets, then at the puppeteer, and eventually at anyone that moved. That resulted in a subsequent ban for at least a decade of dinner rolls at the dinner. So you'd have to have a black tie dinner, but you couldn't have any dinner rolls. You had to have some bread that people couldn't throw, basically, in order to deal with it. But a more successful adjustment that solved that behavior was the decision to have the black tie dinner on the Friday evening before the parade, so that those of us who were in the habit of marching in the parade could go to the dinner, fall into bed, often at a hotel room downtown, then roll back out the next morning and get up to Balboa Park in time for the 9 o'clock opening of the keg and the beginning of the preparation for the parade. And that was a much more civilized evening, and a much more civilized way to get yourself down to Balboa Park, and avoided a whole number of people spending time driving around the city in a situation where they shouldn't have been driving around the city. And so that was one of the ways in which we evolved over the years to better manage our and coordinate our activities along the way.
Was that puppet show year-wise, what year about? Early 80s or?
My guess is that it was probably mid to late 80s, but you'd have to get somebody else who has a more precise recollection than me to help you on that one.
You're the first one that's mentioned that, so this
Well,
is good.
once you mention it, everybody will say, "Oh yeah, I remember now." You can kind of go back and decide when we started having the dinners on the Friday night before the deal, because that'll help tell you when that all changed. Speaker stories. So the most memorable for me, and it's more of a personal observation, is that one year we had, although it was also from hindsight, a hilarious moment. We had Dan Devine, the fellow who had been the head football coach at the University of Notre Dame, God bless us and save us, when they won the national championship in 1977. So it's a number of years later, and he's now out of football, none too soon, some would have said, and on the speakers tour. And so somebody lines him up to come and be the speaker at our dinner. Well, Dan had fallen from favor with the alumni at the University of Notre Dame not too long after the national championship. They are a fickle group, but if nothing else. And he also had some interesting changes in his mentality and behaviors that caused people to question whether he had all of his pencils in the drawer anymore or not. But in any event, he went on the speaking tour, and what people didn't realize, he had moved to Phoenix and had become the president of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And so he showed a 7 or 8 minute highlight reel of wonderful plays from Notre Dame's championship season, which was very well received by the audience. And then he gave a speech about sobriety and avoiding the evils of drink, which was less well received, but I will say there was no repeat of the dinner roll activity, at least until after he left the stage. But he came down afterwards and was standing around, and I mentioned earlier Dan Broderick. His brother, Larry Broderick, was in the habit of coming into town for the festivities on St. Patrick's Day and would come to the black tie dinner. And Larry was an outspoken critic of Dan Devine. And so there we were, 2 or 3 of us, had booked tables right up in front of the stage. And so while Devine was up there taking questions, I actually had gotten up to get drinks for a number of the people at the table. And so I walked back to the table with 6 Budweisers pressed close to my chest, holding them all in long neck Budweisers, while he was explaining the evils of drink and the importance of moderation, and plopped them all down on the table right in front of him. He was looking at me and I was looking at him as we did all this. Then as he later on took questions and mingled for a few minutes, Larry Broderick, his outstanding critic, goes up and tells him how wonderful it was to watch him coaching Notre Dame during their championship series, which earned him the name, which he has not completely lived down yet from his brother Dan, of Mr. Obsequious. And so sometimes we would, if Larry got out of line, we would tell Mr. Obsequious to sit down and be quiet. But I think Dan Devine, for a number of reasons, stands out in my mind as the most ironic choice for a speaker at the Friendly Sons dinner. Memorable wake stories. The best one was when they wouldn't let Mike out of the General Neal out of the coffin, and I think it was the general. I think Bartolotta had his foot on the coffin, if I recall correctly. The coffin was marched in duly into the center of the room, and then while Neal wanted to get out, I think Vince had his foot on the coffin, which was one of the many reasons why eventually, not too long after I was the Irishman of the Year, we named Vince Bartolotta the Irishman of the Year, the only non-Gaelic, ethnically non-Gaelic recipient of that award to my knowledge. But he had drank as much or more Irish whiskey than anybody else in the group, and religiously attended our events and provided countless moments of fun, not least of which when he shows up in his gorilla outfit as Conga the gorilla, which is also managed to do a number of times in Ireland with us as we travel. So if you haven't seen Vince in his, or if you haven't seen Conga, put it better, Vince won't acknowledge that he's Conga, but if you haven't seen Conga, you might mention to Vince your desire to see Conga, and lo and behold, you may actually get to see him.
There's
Well, a subset of the Friendly Sons were very dear friends of Dan Broderick, who sadly was killed, and in about 30 years ago, a bit longer than that now, and after he died, a group of us decided that we would go to Ireland to scatter his ashes. And we did that in a town called Doolin. Some refer to it as the cradle of traditional Irish music. It's a tiny town. In those days it was a one street, about 4-block long town right on the coast of Ireland. And we scattered his ashes one night after quite a long time at the large pub there in town, and it was beautiful. The waves were crashing. It was a great place to do it. We were certain of that. We got up the next morning and realized that adjacent to the spot where he scattered his ashes was a landfill. However, the Republic of Ireland, in its wisdom, has removed the landfill and left the rest of the place intact, and so we have been able to go back and made a habit of going back every 3 years pretty religiously. And so we just did what we called the last hurrah, because some of the boys aren't with us anymore, and some of them are getting a little harder to maneuver, because one of the things that you often have to do to get to the place where we scattered Danny's ashes is you have to climb over a cow gate. And a couple of the fellows had trouble with that because of their size a long time ago, but you combine the size with advanced age and it becomes a real challenge. And so one of many reasons why the lads have probably made their last all-boys group trip to Ireland, although some of us continue to go over in smaller batches, although these days with our spouses, many of whom don't want to let us out of their sight for fear we'll do harm to ourselves. And they're probably right.
And you've made how many trips with the guys?
Every 3 years for 30 years, so we've done 9 or 10. Now we missed a couple of years around 9/11 and that stuff, and we missed one go-around with the pandemic. So I think 9 for sure, maybe 10. The mind wearies of trying to recall all of the nights in all of the pubs. But when we can't remember, we just make up stories and tell them anyway.
Was there anything magical about the 3-year between trips?
It was about all we could afford when we started doing it, and then as time went on with people's lives, it got harder and harder just to everybody plop off for 8 or 9 days by themselves. You know, a lot of us had limited vacation time in a given year, and so explaining to your wife that half or a third of your vacation time was going to be spent with the boys was always tough. Doing it every single year would have probably resulted in some unfortunate marital circumstances and perhaps division of assets that people would prefer to avoid. I may have exhausted my stories unless you have anything else
Well,
you want to...
it's interesting though how a lot of the past presidents prompt stuff, and you're like, oh, I remember this about this guy.
Well,
like Donnie
you
McGrath.
just get us in a room, and it begins to play out. Different guys remember different stuff. But when you're prompted, sure, of course, I remember that, and this and that.
But I'm planning on doing that tomorrow night as a board meeting. So they're gonna do the board meeting. I'm just gonna get the camera, let it go. And Frankie is bringing the general and, you know, so they'll be there.
Well, you know, Leo has been good enough to host some breakfasts
Yep.
over the years before St. Patrick's Day, and that would be a good occasion. You know, he reaches back and gets a good cross-section of guys to turn out, and it is not unusual for whoever the oldest living past president is to be in that
Yep.
room at that time. So
Yeah, I was trying to get Leo, he was just in Ireland not too long ago.
he spent a month in Kinsale.
Yep. And he got back and he
He
said,
said he was. The rumor was that he was about to be elected mayor, so he had to flee. I'm going to have lunch with him in a few weeks, and I'll get the down low.
he said, how about we sit down for a video interview sometime in September or October? I was like, I'd rather do it sooner rather than later.
Well, he could still remember something. Well, the thing about Leo is that he will adjust. You know, he never lets the facts get in the way of a good story. So, of course, you may not care if it's factually accurate as long as it's a good enough story. So, most of the time we don't either.
And there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
With the beginning of the parade, which was I think '81, was the first parade. Did you have involvement with some of that? And who were the guys who were in that?
Well, when the parade came along, there were a couple of things that needed to be attended to. One, you had to raise the money for the parade, and that became an increasing challenge over time. And so the Smiling Irishman contest and other things were created to help generate cash for that. And in addition to the Friendly Sons, who were always the best marching group, but I think we're never allowed to win the award in consecutive years for obvious reasons, but we also had the police and the fire department and various other lesser Irish organizations participate in the parade as well. Almost immediately, Mike Neal was nominated and by acclamation accepted as the parade master for life, because he was the best at giving orders to people. As long as you could get them lined up in a row in their green blazers and black slacks, white shirts, tie, and a cap, preferably with a button, but many without buttons. And so he was the parade master for life, and Reedy was the song master for life for obvious reasons. He could remember the words. And then you had various efforts over time to create new songs in order to help us compete for various awards then being made by the judges of the parade. And there's nothing a drunk Irishman likes more than the idea that you can somehow sing for your supper. And so we did that with some aplomb, and we worked it into our marching routine each year as part of our presentation to the podium at the end or toward the end of the parade. But we always had a good turnout. Over time, the city became somewhat more difficult to deal with in terms of when we could gather, where we were gathering, what we could do in the spot that we gathered in terms of bringing alcohol and kegs of beer and so on. And so there have been adjustments over time, but the spirit has always remained the same. Some of us, eventually our knees were not as happy with us marching for hours, and so we took a less active role, but for a long time it was absolutely a mandatory deal. And indeed, as I said, we would go to the black tie dinner on Friday night, and then get a room, usually at the Grand, and then go up to the park the next morning to begin preparing for our march under General Neal's careful eye and with Michael Joseph Reedy's guidance on the singing of the appropriate songs each year. So, needless to say, there was a movement afoot to stop the Friendly Sons from winning all the awards every year, and so they've decided to give some awards out from time to time to other people besides us, not based on merit, but based on inclusiveness.
We actually just won a best marching thing, which was third place, which was awarded before the parade in Coronado, the
Third
4th of
place?
July parade. Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't know what the genesis of that was.
Money.
Yeah. So Foley and Cronin were key guys in this formation. of the
Well,
first parade.
yeah, Larry Cronin, the merchant of Dublin, always had stuff for sale while he was alive, and usually at the lunch a month before, he would have his portfolio out of shirts and walking sticks and so on, and that was carried forward even after his passing. But he was quite a character and a very good Irishman, and Foley has carried on as well in that tradition.
Well, I think that's gold.
Well, you've got 120% of what I remember.
That's squeezing that sponge out. Excellent.
All right, buddy.
Is great.
Well, thank you.
Much appreciated.
My great pleasure. That's yours.
Sure. And my phone's down to
Nothing.
3%.
Yeah. What is TCNJ?
The College of New Jersey,
Ah,
formerly Trenton State.